You'll never amount to anything, you'll always be a failure, nothing will change that." The words came out of his mouth like a sharp knife, cutting straight to my heart. I cringed, the weight of those words crushing my soul. There was no escaping the look of contempt he gave me, as if I were the most insignificant thing in the world. Every syllable he said seemed to make the pain grow, as if he were punching me hard in the chest. I knew he meant it, and worse, I knew that part of me believed those words. It was as if everything I was, everything I did, would never be enough. I would never be good enough for him, or for anyone. For a moment, all I felt was the certainty that my life would never get anywhere. I was trapped in a destiny of failure, and his words were confirmation of it. But in that moment, something inside me began to shift. I didn't know it yet, but those words would be the spark that would ignite a transformation I never imagined I was capable of. But what no one knew at the time was that that contempt would be what would drive me to face destiny in a way no one could have imagined. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment, that humiliation, would be the turning point in my life. I'd always been the old guy in the class, the one who never participated in conversations, the one who was always left out. Those words, spoken by Jorge, my boss, made me realize something I'd ignored until then. I was allowing others to decide my worth. I was allowing myself to be a shadow of my former self, accepting mediocrity as my destiny. Life seemed like a succession of failures. I was always searching for a way to be heard, to prove I wasn't just a burden, but everything I did seemed in vain. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed the universe was conspiring against me. I found myself in a rut of hopelessness, unsure of how to escape. But inside me, a flame was beginning to ignite. I was tired of being invisible, tired of being the failure. It was then that, without realizing it, I began searching for a way to change my own story. What no one knew, what I didn't even know, was that all of this was preparing me for something greater. Something that would be the greatest proof that even the most insignificant, the most despised, can become a hero when they face their own fear. And then, without warning, an opportunity arose, and I could no longer ignore it. I didn't know what was coming, but something inside me told me this would be my chance to prove I wasn't what everyone thought. I wasn't a failure. I was about to discover that even the most humble, the most overlooked, can make a difference when the right moment arises. In the days that followed, Jorge's humiliation still echoed in my head, but something was different now. A sense of restlessness, a desire to do something that would change my life, even if I didn't know where to begin. Jorge's words, instead of sinking me, began to push me forward, albeit with an intensity one hadn't expected. The routine was the same. The work, the indifferent looks from people, the feeling that nothing really mattered. But inside me, something was forming. I could no longer conform. Something inside me screamed that I had to break out of this spiral of failure, that there was something more waiting for me. It was that night, on my way home from work, that fate found me. I was tired, as always, and I passed the bar, the same bar where I took refuge on empty afternoons. But something was different. A siren cut through the night, followed by another and another. The sound was distant but unmistakable. Something big was happening. I headed to the source of the commotion. The streets were filled with people with tense faces, eyes wide with terror. The chaos seemed to spread like wildfire. I headed toward the city center, where I saw what no one could have imagined, a huge building collapsing. Concrete and dust flew everywhere. People ran, screaming, trying to escape the imminent danger. But something inside me told me not to run. I didn't know why, but Jorge's words were fading, and I was feeling a different strength. It was as if the fear that had once paralyzed me was now a flame pushing me forward. Without thinking, I began to run into the chaos, as if something inside me knew I needed to be there. And then, amid the destruction, I saw him. He was there, amidst the rubble. Jorge. He was trapped, immobilized, the expression on his face a mixture of panic and pain. It wasn't just him there, but others too. People were screaming for help. But it was Jorge who caught my attention first. He was being swallowed up by the tragedy, and suddenly, everything I felt, all the humiliation I'd experienced, vanished. I knew what I had to do. There was no more room for hesitation. Something inside me shifted. It was no longer about what he did to me, but about what I was capable of doing for someone, even the one who made me feel so small. The chaos around me seemed to slow, as if the world were forcing me to make a decision. With each step I took toward Jorge, my body trembled, not from fear, but from growing determination. The pain in my bones, the shortness of breath, everything blended with the sound of screams in the distance. But something kept pushing me forward. I knew I had to act. Jorge was trapped, the concrete beam crushing his leg, and he couldn't move. His hands were bloody, and he tried desperately to crawl, but it was useless. The fear in his eyes was evident, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never imagined. He was vulnerable, just as I'd always been. For a moment, I thought about everything he'd put me through. The humiliation, the looks of contempt, the screams. It all played through my mind like a movie. But in that moment, the hatred wasn't stronger than the need to save a life. I couldn't be the man who ran away again. I needed to be different. With effort, I began to clear the rubble around Jorge. With each stone I moved, I felt the weight of responsibility increase. The heat from the dust burned my throat, and the fear that time was running out consumed me. But something inside me told me I couldn't stop. That my chance to change, to prove I wasn't a failure, was there, right in front of me. When I finally managed to free the beam, he didn't react immediately. His eyes were wide, still surprised by my presence. The look of despair was replaced by silent disbelief. He, who had dismissed me so many times, now looked at me as if he couldn't understand how it was possible. But in that moment, I didn't need an explanation. I didn't need thanks. I just needed a breather, to know I'd done the right thing. "Help me, please." Jorge's voice was low, almost a whisper, but enough to let me know he had no strength left. It was now or never. I helped him up, supporting him as I dragged him to safety, but the weight of the situation made me realize something. His suffering wasn't my victory. I didn't need him to see this as revenge. What I did, and what I continued to do, wasn't about revenge. It was about something deeper, the ability to overcome, even when everyone expected otherwise. I wasn't just saving Jorge. I was saving myself. The moment we managed to escape the rubble, the fire engine sirens grew louder. The sound of rescuers began to fill the space, but my mind was elsewhere. Those words from Jorge, those words that had scarred me for so long, now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. I was no longer the broken man he thought I was. I had done something I never would have imagined. I had saved his life. And maybe, just maybe, that was more than any insult he had ever hurled at me. Even so, the pain, the fatigue, the panic that surrounded us left no room for more words. But the looks, the silent gestures, said it all. I didn't need anything else. The weight of responsibility, of being the unexpected hero, was already transforming me. And I knew that, whatever came next, nothing would be more important than this, the certainty that, in the end, we are capable of much more than we think. The rescue team arrived soon after us, and amid the chaos, I was swept up in the human chain of rescuers who began tending to the injured. But my mind was still fixed on Jorge. He was there, being treated, but his eyes were fixed on me, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. It was a mystery to him, just as it was to me. How could I, the old failure, the man no one appreciated, have acted that way? I couldn't say. I only knew that in that moment, something inside me awakened, something I never imagined existed. A force that made me act without thinking, without hesitation. As the sirens subsided and the chaos of the tragedy began to calm, I finally realized what had truly happened. What began as a fight for Jorge's survival became a fight for my own redemption. I, who had always been invisible, who had always been the one despised, had now done something worthy of recognition. Jorge, for his part, was still in shock, and didn't even have the strength to thank me. But that didn't matter. I knew what I had done was more meaningful than any words he could say. I had done the right thing, even in the face of pain, fear, and humiliation. And that, as simple as it was, transformed me. But the real surprise came the next morning. When I woke up, my phone was full of messages. The first was from Jorge. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, fearing another of his humiliations disguised as gratitude. But what I found made me pause for a moment, stunned. Jorge, in his own words, thanked me. He not only thanked me for saving me, but also acknowledged what I had done for him, something I never imagined hearing from someone like him. But there was more. In the next message, an even bigger surprise. The company where we worked had unexpectedly decided to promote me. Not because of what I did in the tragedy, but because of something few saw, but which I had always known deep down. I was not a failure. I had value. The promotion was symbolic, but for me, it meant so much more. It confirmed that I wasn't trapped by my past, by Jorge's words, or by the fate everyone had imposed on me. I was more than that. And that morning, I realized that the tragedy hadn't destroyed me. It had been the catalyst for my transformation. And who would have thought that the old man everyone despised would become a symbol of resilience, and perhaps of justice? But the true test would come soon, because deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. The mystery behind that tragedy and Jorge's actions was only just beginning to unravel. And I was more than prepared to face whatever was necessary. Because I knew, now more than ever, the greatest victories come not from others, but from ourselves. And in the end, no one would be able to erase what I did that day. Not even Jorge's words. As the days passed, the feeling of having finally broken the cycle of failure and humiliation began to solidify within me. I was at peace with myself, though in my mind a persistent echo still rang out, "What else is to come?" I knew my journey was far from over. The promotion I received at work brought temporary relief, a sense of validation, but what really moved me was the realization that I had done something no one would have expected. I, a man invisible to the eyes of the world, had now become the hero of that tragedy. Not because I was recognized, but because I was capable of doing the right thing at the right time, without thinking about the consequences. But there was something else no one knew, something that was still at stake. One morning, about a week after the tragedy, I received an unexpected visit to my office. It was the police. I was stunned. Something has happened, I thought. They've come to arrest me, to accuse me of something. My mind panicked for a moment, but the officer's reaction was the last thing I expected. They explained to me that they were investigating the building collapse and that, during their investigation, they discovered something much more serious than a simple tragedy. Jorge, my boss, was involved in a massive corruption scheme. The building that collapsed was part of an irregular project, using counterfeit materials, which he had approved to cut costs and secure illegal profits. I was in shock. How could something like this be possible? Jorge, who had always seemed so untouchable, so above everything, was now being unmasked as the one responsible for so many lives at risk, for this tragedy that nearly killed us all. What surprised me was that, even though I was aware of all this, I felt no pleasure in the revelation. In fact, the feeling that washed over me was that of a heavy burden. I knew I had saved someone who, ultimately, was involved in something so foul. But at the same time, I knew that wasn't what defined my actions. I saved him because it was the right thing to do, and that, in the end, was what set me free. I no longer cared about his corruption, or the consequences it would bring to my life. What I did for him had nothing to do with his flaws. I had overcome everything he had made me suffer because I now knew that my strength lay no longer in the words that humiliated me, but in my actions. Jorge's investigations continued, and he was eventually arrested. But for me, that no longer mattered. I didn't need traditional justice to know I had found something far more valuable, my own worth. And perhaps, in the end, this was the greatest transformation I could have experienced. I was no longer the old failure. I was no longer the person everyone saw as a joke. I was someone capable of doing what was right, even when no one believed in me. Because true greatness comes not from the approval of others, but from our ability to rise up, even when we're at rock bottom, and decide that we will no longer be defined by what others say. I found my strength in pain, in humiliation, and, yes, even in tragedy. Because, in the end, it's not what happens to us that matters, but what we do with it. And, as difficult as it was, I knew I was ready for anything. Because I had already faced what I feared most, myself. Time passed, and life seemed to calm down after Jorge's arrest and the revelations about the corruption scheme. People began to look at me differently, as if I had somehow transformed. Many of my co-workers began to treat me with more respect, recognizing my ability to act when everyone else was frozen in fear. But something inside me told me this journey wasn't over yet. I didn't know exactly what else might come, but I felt there was one last lesson I needed to learn. Something was still off. I, who had always been the man afraid of being seen, was now constantly being looked at in a way that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't about being the failure anymore, but about knowing who I really was. Then, one autumn afternoon, I received an unexpected call. It was from a former coworker, someone who had been fired from the company for a past mistake, and someone I never expected to hear. He told me he had something important to tell me, something related to that tragedy, something that would change everything I thought about my own transformation. I knew what he was about to tell me could be something big, but at the same time, a part of me wanted to leave it all behind. I had been through so much, I had done what no one would believe. But I couldn't ignore it. It was stronger than me. When we met, he revealed something that left my heart cold. Jorge wasn't solely responsible for the collapse. He had been just the tip of the iceberg. The real mastermind behind it all was someone I never would have imagined. Someone who was behind many of the company's bad decisions. Someone who, no matter how much I had overcome, continued to influence my life in ways I still didn't understand. And worst of all, this person was, in some way, connected to my own past. Something I had ignored, something I never wanted to face, but now could no longer run from. The true test of my transformation, of my true strength, lay not in being the hero of a tragedy, but in confronting the shadows of my own past. This made me wonder, had I truly overcome what had made me fail, or was I just hiding my own weaknesses, unsure how to deal with them? What would I do now? Would I continue to be the improvised hero who saved Jorge, or would I have the courage to face an enemy much closer to home than I could have imagined? These questions began to haunt me. But at the same time, I felt more prepared to face them. I was no longer the weak man, the invisible man. I had proven to myself that I could change. And, most importantly, I was willing to do whatever it took to protect what was left of me. Deep down, I knew this new chapter in my life wouldn't be easy. But I was no longer afraid of who I was or what might come. I had discovered that true strength lay not in seeking external redemption, but in confronting my own flaws and never stopping fighting for what I believed was right. Because, in the end, the true hero isn't the one admired by others. The true hero is the one who, in a world full of uncertainty and failure, finds within themselves the courage to continue, to change, and to never stop fighting, no matter how much the world around them seems to be crumbling. I knew this now, and so I was ready for whatever came next. Just when I thought the storm had passed, that I would finally have peace to live with the consequences of my actions, a new truth emerged, darker and more complex than I could have imagined. The man who had saved Jorge, the old failure everyone despised, was now being challenged to face a truth he had never anticipated. And this consumed me more than any tragedy, more than any humiliation I had ever experienced. The truth revealed by my former coworker hit me like a thunderbolt. The person behind all the corruption and mistakes that led to the collapse was someone from within my own life, someone I never would have imagined. This person, unbeknownst to me, had manipulated the environment around me for years, planting seeds of destruction without anyone knowing. It was clear that the tragedy was no mere accident. It was the result of a well-orchestrated plot, and I had been a pawn in this game. That revelation changed my perspective on everything. I was no longer just the old man who saved someone from tragedy, the unlikely hero. I had unwittingly become part of a larger plot, a conspiracy that extended beyond my comprehension. Now, I not only wanted to save what was left of my life, but I also needed to destroy what had been imposed on me. The person responsible for the real fraud wasn't just someone I worked with. He was someone I expected support and trust from. He was someone who had infiltrated my life with a friendly smile, who knew me well enough to keep me vulnerable. And, worse still, someone who had known my weakness and exploited it to keep me in a state of submissive failure for so long. This was more than a simple betrayal. It was a psychological game that had left me trapped, manipulated, without realizing it. I knew I needed to act, but the fear this time was different. It wasn't fear of what might happen to me, but rather of what I might lose. I, the old failure, now had a greater responsibility. I was no longer a victim of the system. I had become part of the solution, and the journey of transformation I began with Jorge's rescue now led me down a much more difficult and challenging path. The pressure mounted as I prepared to confront this person. I knew it was too late to turn back. But I also knew there was no more time to waste. This wouldn't just be a battle for justice, but for my own redemption, for the chance to finally leave behind the life of failure that had defined me for so long. Deep down, I no longer wanted to be the unlikely hero. I wanted to be more than that. I wanted to be someone who fought not only against others, but against the ghosts of my own past. Those ghosts that haunted me, defining me as a person incapable of change, of being someone better. I had saved Jorge's life, but now, more than ever, I knew my mission was much greater. The old man everyone said would never amount to anything was about to do the impossible, unmask the true face of corruption lurking in the shadows, expose the lie that had controlled me for so long, and shatter the facade of a world that had kept me small. Now, I was ready for whatever came. Pain, fear, and doubt no longer held sway over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I did know one thing. I would no longer be defined by others. I was the architect of my own change, and no one, not even the past, could stop that. I was no longer the old failure. I was the man who faced his greatest weakness, who stared into the abyss, and instead of retreating, decided to move forward. And that, perhaps, was the greatest transformation of all. Because, in the end, true power lies not in being seen as a hero, but in being able to transform one's own life, even when everything around you seems to be falling apart. I didn't know exactly what to expect after that revelation. What I began to realize, however, was that my own perception of courage was changing. With every step I took, every decision I made, the weight of responsibility grew. I knew that confronting the person behind all this wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't just be a fight against corruption or lies, but against everything I believed to be true about myself. What confused me most, however, was how insecure and vulnerable I still felt. How could I, the old failure, be able to stand up to someone so powerful, so manipulative? The person who had placed me in a position of weakness for so long knew far more about me than I cared to admit. She knew where to hurt me, knew how to keep me trapped, even without realizing it. And it consumed me. But what I was beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, was that true strength didn't come from the absence of fear. It wasn't about being invincible, but about acting even when fear was eating away at us. As if I had discovered my own fragility, and yet I had decided to move forward. I knew the truth about corruption was closer than I imagined. I just needed to take the right step, the final step, the one that would finally lift me out of the shadow of who I'd always been and face who I was becoming. The person I could be. The greatest challenge I now faced wasn't just destroying the system that had oppressed me. The greatest obstacle was confronting my own hesitation, the fear that by doing so, my life would once again be consumed by the same loneliness and powerlessness. After all, wasn't that what had defined me for so long? But in that moment I knew, if I went back now, everything I'd done to change would have been for nothing. I needed to move on. And that's when everything started to fall into place. I went as far as the truth took me, no longer afraid to face whatever was necessary. Confronting this person, exposing the corruption, and finally exposing the games being played in the shadows, this wasn't just a matter of justice for others. It was a matter of justice for myself. The fight wouldn't be easy. The consequences of my actions could put me at risk, but at the same time, I knew nothing could stop me. I had already saved someone from tragedy. I had overcome my own humiliation. Now, I was ready to save myself. That night, when I finally decided to face this person, it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. But deep down, something inside me clicked. I was no longer trapped. I was stronger, more prepared. And even though I didn't know what the future held, I knew that the only thing that could define my story was what I decided to do now. What I had learned so far was simple yet profound. It's not the words of others that define us, but our actions. And my actions now were guided by something far stronger than any fear or doubt I'd felt in the past. That night, I made a decision that would change my life forever. No longer the old man who held others back, but the man who would face anything and everyone, for the only reason that matters, to be truly free. I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But looking back, I realized the greatest victory wasn't in what I did, but in what I became to do it. Because, in the end, true strength comes from the courage to be who you truly are, even when the world insists on telling you otherwise. The decision I made that night wasn't just about confronting someone. It was about confronting my own story, my own identity. I was about to take a step from which there was no turning back, and although the fear was still there, I no longer saw it as an obstacle. It was just a shadow, something I had learned to navigate. The transformation I had experienced up to that point told me that the next step was inevitable, and I was ready for it. The next day, I made the decision to meet with that person, the one truly responsible for all the manipulation. The meeting was arranged with calculated coldness. You knew he would feel in control of the situation, but it didn't matter. I was no longer playing the game of being manipulated. I was no longer the old loser. I was someone who had finally decided to take control of my own life. I arrived at the appointed location, an office on the outskirts of the city. The tension in the air was palpable, as if every step I took was charged with an electrical charge. He was there, sitting behind a desk, with that arrogant smile that had so irritated me all those years. But now, something was different. I looked into his eyes, and instead of seeing the man I'd always thought unbeatable, I saw only a person about to lose everything. Without hesitation, I began to lay out everything I knew about his schemes. Every lie, every manipulation, every action of his that had destroyed so many lives, including mine. When I finished, he didn't seem nervous. He wasn't surprised. He was just there, as if he knew that, no matter how much I knew the truth, he still had control. But something shifted in me in that moment. Instead of worrying about what he would do next, I finally understood that true power lay in my choice to act. It didn't matter if he thought he was smarter or stronger. I was no longer there to prove anything to anyone. I was there to do what was right. He tried to defend himself, tried to make me doubt what I knew to be the truth. But there was no longer any room for fear or insecurity. Every word he said felt like a desperate attempt to maintain what remained of his empire of lies. And when he finally realized he had no more leverage to manipulate me, something I never imagined happened. He fell silent. For a moment, I looked at him, and what I saw wasn't the person who had humiliated me, who had made me feel less than I was. I saw a defeated man, with no more words, no more excuses. He was no longer a threat. I had already defeated him by exposing his truth. What remained was not the sense of victory I had imagined, but a sense of relief, of liberation. I knew this didn't mean everything was over. The struggle would still continue, but in that moment, what mattered most was that, for the first time, I was in control. No longer dominated by shame, fear, or doubt. I had found my voice, my strength, and I was finally living the life I deserved to live. What happened next was a series of developments. The investigations that followed brought to light not only the lies he had spread for so long, but also the system of corruption he and others had built. The truth began to be revealed, and what seemed like an impossible battle for the old loser became a victory, not only for me, but for everyone involved in that plot. When everything calmed down, I looked back and realized that the true hero of my story wasn't the one who saved Jorge in the tragedy, but the man who finally knew when it was time to save himself. It wasn't about being recognized or admired anymore. What mattered was that I had done what seemed impossible. I had achieved my freedom, and no one could take that away from me. And in the end, I realized that the greatest rescue of all wasn't saving lives or destroying villains. The greatest rescue was my own. Because, in the end, true victory doesn't come from without, but from within. It's born the moment you courageously decide that you will no longer be a prisoner to the words, expectations, or limitations others try to impose on you. After all, what is worth saving if not yourself? Time passed, and with the closure of the case and the revelations about corruption, my life began to stabilize. However, something in me had changed forever. I was no longer that fragile man, guided by the opinions of others, by the fear of judgment, or by words of contempt. I was now someone different, more whole, more confident. Still, silently, I continued my journey of transformation. I knew that true victory wasn't just what I had achieved materially or professionally. The greatest reward was what I had done for myself. What I had learned about myself, about my ability to overcome, to be strong when no one believed in me. In one of my rare moments of reflection, while walking alone on a quiet afternoon, a simple idea occurred to me. Everything I had experienced, every step of pain and suffering, every humiliation, had served to shape me. I wouldn't have gotten this far, wouldn't have been able to act so decisively, without these experiences. At that moment, I realized something even more powerful. I had not only overcome adversity, I had learned to embrace my scars, to recognize them as fundamental parts of my journey. They were no longer symbols of weakness, but of resilience. I was not the man the world said I was. I was the man I had chosen to be. With this understanding, the truth about my life, which had previously seemed like a story of failures, of setbacks, now revealed itself as a story of overcoming. What happened with Jorge, what happened with the company, and everything else that unfolded was no longer what mattered. What mattered was what I was doing with the person I had become. And, surprisingly, people began to notice. Although time had erased Jorge's wounds, the scars the redemption process had left on me were visible, and I knew my transformation was not going unnoticed. My behavior, my attitudes, and, above all, the way I treated myself, were speaking louder than any words. I had truly become the person I always strived to be, someone who, even in the darkest moments, never stopped fighting for my freedom. It was then that I finally received an offer that reflected everything I had achieved. The company invited me to take on a leadership role, but more than that, it offered me the opportunity to change the organization's culture, to transform the workplace from a toxic and manipulative place to one where people could truly grow, be seen, and be valued, regardless of their position. The invitation was more than just professional recognition. It was confirmation that I had found the strength not only to save myself, but also to impact those around me, to change something that seemed immutable. When I accepted the offer, it wasn't with a desire to prove anything to others, but with the certainty that I was ready to help others find the same strength I had found within myself. Because, in the end, I realized that true transformation lies not only in how we overcome our own challenges, but in how we help others overcome theirs. The journey that began with humiliation and failure was now a story of leadership and impact. And what I learned most is that the true measure of a person is not their failures, but their ability to rise up, make a difference, and be someone who, even after everything, never gives up on being better. And looking back, reflecting on everything I'd experienced, I knew that, in the end, the greatest achievement of all wasn't saving a life or exposing corruption. The greatest achievement was finally saving myself, finding myself again, and understanding that strength lies within each of us, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be lived. Because, in the end, true transformation begins within us. And no one, not even the past, can stop us from writing the story we choose to live. As time passed and my new life began to take shape, a sense of peace and purpose washed over me. No longer was the weight of doubt or shame lingering daily. I was no longer the person who felt invisible or inferior. I had done something few would be able to do. I faced my greatest insecurities, my flaws, and transformed every bit of pain I carried into strength. The leadership position I accepted at the company gave me the platform to put everything I had learned into practice. But, contrary to what many expected, it wasn't about seeking recognition or validation. My true goal was to create an environment where people could be themselves, without fear of failure, without fear of being seen as weak. I wanted to build a culture where vulnerability was seen as a strength, and where mutual support was the foundation. When I began working on the company's transformation, my vision was clear. I wasn't there to take revenge on anyone. I didn't want others to feel the same burden I'd felt over the years. I wanted to be proof that true change comes from within, and that when you decide to do good, you impact the world around you in ways you can't even imagine. And the change was gradual but noticeable. Over time, I developed bonds of trust with my colleagues. They began to open up, sharing their own struggles and challenges, knowing they wouldn't be judged. Each of us carried our scars, but instead of driving us apart, they united us. We began to see what we had in common, and this transformed our workplace into a place of empathy and growth. While all this was happening, I also met the man who, in the past, would have been responsible for keeping me in a state of servitude, Jorge. Now removed from the company, he was trying to rebuild his life. There was no longer any resentment within me, only a sense of understanding. He, like all of us, was a product of the choices he had made throughout his life. The difference was that, unlike him, I had chosen to change. We met casually in a cafe, in no rush to resolve the past. He seemed genuinely sorry for the things he'd done, not just to me, but to everyone around him. During our conversation, there were no accusations or resentments. Just a silent understanding that life teaches us, in relentless ways, that we can always change. We may not have control over the mistakes we make, but we do have the freedom to choose who we will be from now on. It was in that conversation that I realized something profound. True healing isn't just about correcting past mistakes, but about learning from them and using them to become a better version of yourself. I'd already done that, and he was beginning to do the same, in his own way. Over the next few months, my life stabilized in a way I never imagined possible. The company began to thrive at a pace I hadn't anticipated, and people began to recognize not just my title, but the real impact we were creating together. The work I did wasn't about numbers or results, but about making a difference in people's lives, helping them see that they weren't alone, that failure wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new. And while all this was happening, one reflection still resonated within me. The journey I had lived was not simply a story of overcoming, but a story of reconfiguration. I rewrote my narrative. I transformed suffering, humiliation, and failure into a powerful tool for doing good. Because I knew that, ultimately, life's greatest lessons come not from successes, but from failures. And in falling, I discovered that it is always possible to rise again, stronger, wiser, more willing to create a world where people can feel safe to be who they truly are. Looking back today, I know that the journey of transformation I experienced didn't end with professional or personal redemption. It was, and continues to be, about the impact I can have on the lives of others, about being a reflection of the change I wanted to see in the world, and about reminding myself every day that, ultimately, we are the ones who define our worth. Because, in the end, the greatest strength we can have is the ability to courageously build a new chapter, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. True victory, perhaps, lies not in never falling, but in always rising. And I finally understood that transformation is not a destination, but a continuous process of evolution.